It's good to be with you. I have never been in North Dakota before, and so I'm excited to be able to drop in and take the time to share with you. And I think one of the core bits that I want to sort of lay out as we get started is just the expectation that some of this is going to be review for some of you. Thomas, you mentioned you've read through the Strong Towns book before. I'm kind of diving into some of this content, and I think what I want to try to help with is always thinking, how do we popularize the arguments or the explanations that we offer to people about what is it that makes for a financially productive pattern in a community? Parking feels like one of those things that everybody should just have. It should be available, it should be abundant, and it should be free. And yet, when we actually begin to ask questions about a financially productive pattern for our cities, we realize, well, free doesn't apply, but abundant better apply, or else we're going to be going broke. And we better have it be available for all of us, across our communities, we see places that have the capacity to build lasting prosperity. We all know what a sugar high looks like. We all know what a short-term win looks like. But if it comes at the cost of a bigger, longer-term capacity building for our community, that's going to severely impact our communities. And so our core message at Strong Towns, the way that we've chosen to summarize it, or at least I had to in the back of an Uber that was racing to an airport at one time. I was late for a flight. We didn't end up making it. She said, "What's Strong Towns all about?" And I was like, kind of, can you keep your eyes on the road? But also, the prevailing pattern of development that we see around us is making our places weak and fragile. And I'll go into what we mean when we say that. And then with the courage of an advocate, we seek to change that. This is something that, to me, one of the things that stands out in the way that we talk about Strong Towns and the work that we do as an organization, a member-supported organization going all over North America and now in other parts of the world too, is so many people have been Strong Towns before Strong Towns ever came on the scene. Having this core recognition, we are maybe not right now seeing everything that we need to be seeing about the way that we have built out our communities. Because our current path, what at Strong Towns we call the suburban experiment, really kicked off after the Second World War. That path, which was meant with the best of intentions as a means of building even greater prosperity than our ancestors ever experienced, that has had this visceral sort of impact on our communities, where it feels like for a time we're doing pretty good. But the longer term consequences is that it is actually a system and a pattern of development that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. And what's important to point out is it's not the fault of an individual. It's not the fault of like a bunch of people. It's generationally, we made an all-in commitment to a pattern of building out our cities that really changes the way in which we consider what it takes to build lasting prosperity in our communities. Thanks to some of the volunteers in the Strong Towns Fargo group, this is the Strong Towns Finance Decoder, which is using tools that the Canadian equivalent of the Public Sector Accounting Board put together. I'm going to show you a handful of graphs. For those that graphs are your love language, you're going to love this. For the rest of you, we can suffer together as we work our way through it. To understand just what are we looking at in terms of the longer-term financial trajectory of your community. So this is taken from your city's annual comprehensive financial report, ACFR. This is in your annual report. Every year, cities all across the United States and in Canada release standardized reports that you can mix and match one city to another. And the idea of the standards is that year over year, you're able to see the same numbers being represented. The challenge is if you go and read those reports, they show 2 years at a time. And I've yet to see a single ACFR that has more than 2 years represented. And so at Strong Towns, we said, how hard can it be to be able to plot that over the long term? And the Public Sector Accounting Board in Canada, the equivalent of it, they had come up with indicators of financial conditions for cities. And it was interesting, one of the cities, Winnipeg, which is north of you here, causing your flooding problems, I believe in this area, might be part of the Blame Canada. Wrong direction, okay. You flood them, oh, thank you. They actually started to use these numbers for several years, posting them in their budget reports until they realized, one, nobody requires us to post this, and two, the numbers make us look like we're actually becoming a weaker and more fragile community, so they stopped. So 2005 or 2015 to 2017, they were using these numbers, and as it starts, it asks, how much do you have in terms of financial capacity within the community that the city has or the municipality has, cash on hand, all of the receivables, sort of that which is available on a turnaround basis to be able to cover your costs if that need came up. How much money do you have in your wallet, you could say, compared with how much is on your credit card. And the challenge for a city like Fargo, and you're not alone, there are many places that are experiencing this, is that you have a pattern of development. This is back to 2009, but if we went way, way, way back, we would actually see that there's been this decline, this trending downwards of our city's capacities to meet its own needs. That if the city of Fargo simply ended today, it would have over 600,000 or 600 million that would have to be paid out. So imagine what bankruptcy looks like when you have that, or just shy of $600,000 here to be able to pay out. This is the challenge that the city finds itself in, which raises important questions. What do you do about it? I'm not a scientist, I'm not a brilliant strategist, but I know that when we look at a bad situation, we want to ask, what do we do about this? You can represent it in another way of saying, what is the ratio between our cash and our total liabilities? And if it's anything less than 1, it means that you owe more, or even significantly more, than you have on hand for the city. If you say, well, we want to balance that, or we want to get back to a full, at least having as much cash on hand, you could do things like sell the Fargo Dome, you could do things like sell off different public assets, you could hold a fire sale on streets, but they're really hard to auction off. You could try to rip up pipes and send them off to Bismarck and see if they would buy them off of you. But most of the assets that the city actually has, its physical assets, are basically illiquid. You cannot pass them on to somebody else. They just are in the ground, or they just are attached to the space that we occupy. And so in this context, one of the challenges is that you're seeing this trending downwards. And one of the things that we encourage all of our local conversations to do, residents of a community, is to ask, all right, why have these numbers shifted? Become that sleuth in your community. I don't have the full answers as to why there's been a brief upturn. What is the conditions that is giving rise to that? But it asks and probes us to ask really important questions about what is going on in our communities. Your total assets. Like if we look at this, if for all of the assets that you have divided by your total liabilities, this would be, if you did a fire sale, you would need for every about $2 of assets that you have $1 of liability. That's a significant imbalance, because it means you're deeply indebted, if not necessarily to the bank of your infrastructure that needs to be maintained, and the challenges of keeping all of that up. We also looked at what is your net debt compared to your total revenues. Fargo is actually doing all right in this regard. It's in terms of the actual amount that it owes, but as we see, one of the challenges is that your physical condition is degrading. And this is the checkup that nobody wants to hear. At this point, I'm in my lab coat. I'm coming into you with your cholesterol report. I'm like, it's not great. You've got buildup here. You've got issues to deal with. And part of that is that the build out of all of the city's assets, in most cities, about 80% of your capital assets are your streets and your pipes and your roads and all of that stuff that is necessary to serve neighborhoods, be they as broad as you can see from the airplane, or a more compact built form like what our ancestors used to build in. In this context, all of those assets compared to their original cost. So if everything was at 100% condition, which the moment that you resurface a street, the accountant comes in and says, okay, that is going to pull that line up because that street suddenly is back to its original or sort of new condition. So anytime that you're doing road work, anytime you're doing repairs, anytime you build a big new library or other facility like that, whenever this library came on, that would have helped to pull this line upwards, which is the challenge. If you are seeing municipally funded construction in your city, and the line is still going down, it means that not only are you not managing to catch up, it's actually accelerating the amount that you're going to have to repair, replace, renew over time. And cities that struggle to be below or find themselves below 60% replacement are in a real challenging position, because now you're beginning to see more and more evidence of this decline. Even as you're building new neighborhoods that have brand new infrastructure, that's the stuff that is sort of helping to pull up that line. But the challenge is that is going to degrade in about 30 years, 25 years, depending on how harsh the weather conditions are, maybe even 20 years. And in that context, your challenge is, how do we cover those costs? So the last one, just to point out, this is more of a political question, but an important one, is how vulnerable is your city to the whims of higher levels of government? I'll say I was surprised at how much of your total revenue each year comes from government transfers. This is the highest I've seen so far, so well done. But I share that because of a concern that high dependency on outside levels of government really creates a situation which you are basically at the whim of other levels of government. And the state level government and the federal level of government in the United States, they have a lot of other responsibilities. And keeping up city infrastructure is not one of those. And so there are at times splashy outlays of new funds, new infrastructure dollars going out the door, but a lot of that is for new stuff. A lot of that is for new stuff with higher price tags, when the city's core work of just covering its costs, making repairs, doing that type of work is vitally necessary. And so Arlette had done a presentation on this previously. I would definitely recommend check out and have a conversation with Arlette and others in the group about these types of things. But we're at the end of the graphs, mercifully. But the reason I wanted to start with this is to ask that question. When we have discussions about the availability of parking, or the availability of parks, or the availability of daycares, or whatever that looks like, we always say there's a higher order question that needs to be asked, which is, are we financially productive? Because if we want to have good parks, great places to park, great places to go to, great places for our children, we actually have to have a financial base from which we can fund that. Or else we're going to run on fumes, or we're going to be borrowing, or we're going to be begging. And so in this context, one of the challenges that Strong Towns has helped to popularize is what is evident even here in the city of Cochrane, Alberta. So they took a look at their value on a per acre basis, or here per hectare because it was in Canada, although as a Canadian I don't even use per hectare. So odd numbers, but the ratio holds. And they said all of the old stuff that was built, and I'll show you what that looks like. Their older downtown actually was and continues to be significantly more prosperous and more capable of producing lasting prosperity in the community compared to the rest of the city with a very suburban development pattern, or even the new stuff that they were building, which is blockier, which is bigger sort of land allotments, more room for parking, all of those different types of things. And the question is, if even the brand new things with the height of computer modeling, the best insights of the quants and all of the smart people in short pants that work at Goldman Sachs or other places, if they're not even creating something that's as productive in our community as our old stuff, at Strong Towns we say we've got to learn that lesson then. We need to actually replace a pattern of development that is less productive in its brand new form and more compact form, but far less productive, or is far more productive than a lot of the other stuff that we've been building out en masse. And I could see from the airplane, I forgot to put the photos in, but you've got a lot of that suburban sort of expansion that is just horizontal expansion without the capacity for thickening up, for doing simple things like allowing a mix of different uses to just be native in these spaces. And where you do have that kind of mixing of uses, you can see these spikes of productivity in the midst of a sea of missing opportunities that are there. And so I mentioned value per acre, but I want to touch or explain this just a little bit more fully. Again, if you've been part of the Strong Towns movement for a while, this will be familiar, but hopefully sharing just a few ideas of how to share this with others, how to have that conversation if you're putting out your garbage at the curb and somebody else says, man, things are not the way that they used to be. To say, well, there's reasons. You could be, my son for quite a long time his favorite line was, well, actually, and then would launch into an explanation of what was, the actually that he wanted to explain. In this case, this is a little bit of like a well, actually. Because we have in our cities significant property tax and sales tax drivers. You might have a Walmart, and so in Mount Vernon, Washington, the Walmart on an annual basis, they would get in their jet from Bentonville, fly in, and drop $300,000 on the counter of City Hall, and oh, thank you for coming to our town, and bequeathing all of this upon us. Meanwhile, they had other smaller shops, a little co-op grocery store. They would bring in 10,000, they would bring in 20,000. And so the idea was like, well, we need more Walmarts and fewer of these other sort of, wackos that are selling overpriced mangoes and getting into a situation where basically they're okay, but what we want is the big stuff. And so we asked the question, well, of the amount of land that is consumed in order to generate that $300,000, are we actually generating maybe much more on a per acre basis from that whole collection of small shops, that whole collection of small businesses that are contributing significantly more because they use the land much more effectively? And the best analogy for this is the way that we measure miles per gallon. I don't even know what that little thing is there, but imagine if you want to figure out which vehicle could go the furthest. If I put a large slip tank in the back of that truck, I could probably drive the furthest. But the question that we ask is, how much do we put in order to get a certain output? And in that case, you're going to drive that vehicle that's not as sexy, that's not as useful, usefulness is measured different ways, but has that ability to just go further with fewer resources. And when we think of the work of living in a city, we have to do a lot with very little. And so we need to make good use of scarce resources. And this is something that our ancestors knew. This is, if you've ever played the game Oregon Trail or other types of things, like you have to have a limited amount and then you venture out and you need to make it last. And the work of building strong cities really requires that same mindset. And so we say, we can't just take, well, which vehicle can drive the furthest, or in the property equivalent, which one drops the biggest amount of cash on the desk. It's on a per acre basis, on the use of what we have, how effective are these? And so I ran the numbers here in your city, and I'll switch over here because some of the text is a little bit smaller on my side. This is your jewelry store, Royal Jewelers, I believe, 73 Broadway. And I always like to include all of the details. So it's on a 0.10 acre site, very compact, 2 stories. I'm not sure what's on the second story, but some type of use, and that use would have shifted and evolved over many years. Its actual purchase price, if you went out tomorrow and bought the jewelry store, would be $1.1 million, plus the whatever they have inside it, which is probably more than $1 million. But that building, just some shell, has successfully captured $11 million on a per acre basis. And again, we're comparing much like miles per gallon. This older building here, built in 1916 on a 0.13 acre site, so that's specifically that structure that's there with some small area at the back for parking, on a 0.13 acre site is coming in at $16.7 million per acre. Then I asked the question, well, what is that parking lot that takes up the whole front of that space? What is its value? It's consuming significantly more land on a 0.5 acre site, and comes in at a whopping $769,000 per acre. So that drop off is the cost of ample parking. That lack of productivity in your downtown is the consequence of saying, what if we had ample, easy, and free parking for everybody? And again, we might accept that if we can afford to. We might accept this if we could just simply demonstrate our financial position is great, everybody's social and health outcomes are excellent, and so we'll allow some slop or some sort of areas that don't really contribute for themselves, so long as we have buildings like this every so often, sort of populate them everywhere, kind of at some distance from each other, and then fill in the rest of the gaps with parking, then we'll be fine. But this is what we've done with a lot of the downtown, even after the city of Fargo has made some significant improvements to zoning standards and requirements to allow for the correction of a serious challenge to the way that we built out our communities. And when we talk at Strong Towns about the suburban experiment, a continent-wide experiment in building communities in a very different way, and there's a whole other talk I'd love to give on the longer story of that, it was making a bet that we could build out cities in a very different way. We could build out the suburbs in a very different way. We could basically take a lot of suburban standards and smuggle them into our downtown, to the point where much of the historic building stock in our communities, if they burned down, would not be allowed to be rebuilt because the suburban standards now dictated what you could do within the city. And in that context, parking looms large. And so if we look at this and we begin to shift our development pattern, as I took a whole bunch of properties on First Avenue, just to kind of get a sense of a snapshot of how this begins to shift. This is at 810, so just a few streets over, on a 0.33 acre site, comes in at significantly less than what our ancestors who were doing their own version of the Oregon Trail sort of get somewhere and then settle there development pattern. In that context, they were building structures that held and continue to hold significant value, whereas the more recent versions that we've begun to create have significantly less. So that the purchase price of that is just a little bit less than what you would pay for the Royal Jeweler, but the actual value or capacity to return value to the community, to the Commonwealth, is significantly less, is deeply impaired. As we move down, then all of a sudden I was struck because I was like, wow, here's this little outlier. Notice this one, on a very modest site, more than enough for the law firm to work, more than enough, and yes, there's available street parking, there's some need for additional parking elsewhere, but if you had a lot more buildings like this, a very intense financial performance, this would be the way in which we begin to address that longer term shortfall. Does this property, even though it's valued at only $131,000, but if you have a whole bunch of them filling up, say, a 10-acre site, would that be able to cover the costs of street repairs? Would that be able to cover the costs of road repairs? Would there be enough hands and enough taxpayers present there to take from their capacity to then take a portion of it for the care of the Commonwealth? And I would say, no matter your political persuasion, I'm a Canadian, so I'm not allowed to talk politics in the US and then just leave. But no matter where you are on the political landscape, you are going to accept that we have to take from our private wealth a fraction of it, and we have debates over what size that fraction should be, take a fraction of that and use it for the Commonwealth, for the common good, or for the common realm. Remember, that's what a city is us collectively saying, we're going to care for our place. There are some things that we do better together. That's why we're going to do it as a municipality. And then there's some things that we do well on our own, which is the things that we do with private property with our private capacity. So this type of a site has tremendous potential to cover all of the adjoining costs because the tax bill is not going to be so significant compared to the value that is present there on a per acre basis. And so this is, again, still on that same street, but you can see in the way that this was built in 1898, you've got a great older structure sort of evidencing build to the street, build to where the prosperity is, build to where the opportunities emerge, and you've got a number of them, and then this new entrant onto the street is actually going to have a similar financial performance or even better. This is that scale of gradually sort of deepening or improving the neighborhood streets so that this becomes this over time, but begins to develop that cluster of real economic opportunity that's emerging here. But if we go down further, I don't think this was built in 1947. It's probably been rebuilt, but that was what the property map for Fargo was saying. But this is on almost a half-acre site. You can see the moment that you have ample, free, and widely available parking, your property values plummet on a per-acre basis, which means reduced tax revenues, reduced contributions to the public purse, reduced opportunities. It also sort of amplifies the amount of land that is simply consumed, and it creates conditions in which walking from this site to the next one, as we begin to see half-acre lots, as we begin to see larger and larger lots, you begin to lose that experience or that capacity for that street to really be lively, for that street to really work well for a lot of different people, because you're only walking by the side of that building and then it's an ample parking lot for a long time, rather than here where that can be, you could go to the doctor, then the dentist, then the lawyer, then the accountant, then the pizza shop, then wherever else, well, probably after the pizza shop, back to the doctor. You could do all of that work together. In contrast with what we've said, which is, what if we did single-use items and give them tons of parking and make that available. And again, this is a choice, and this is why we say that question of the capacity that we're building in our community is a higher order question than just should there be X number of parking spaces or Y number of parking spaces. Again, we can see more of that shifting development pattern. This is from 1966, but now it's being built further away from the street. The idea was the street is noisy, it's loud, so let's move everything away. Those standards, those setbacks became enshrined in law. This is too close, this is a risk to drivers. We would see that in a lot of our standards documents that our cities were working with. That building is too close, it's a risk to drivers. So isn't it just better if we do this? Well, it may be better if your sole concern is available parking as well as the safety of drivers who might veer off that road, but it really does a number on the numbers that are generated on this site. Here we look, again, this is built, it says 1948, maybe it was an original service station or something like this, but it's been stuck in this state for a considerable period of time. And again, that value per acre continues to plummet as we begin to lose track of the way in which we built strong, vibrant neighborhoods. And sometimes people will push back and be like, well, downtown land is just more valuable. Well, yeah, because more is happening with it. More is capable of being produced with it. This site just up the street is not very far away from the site that I'm showing here on University, because it's still on First Ave, and yet it's a significant drop-off in the amount of financial productivity. What about if we talk about the brand new stuff? So this is quite new, built in 2017, the Chick-fil-A on a 1.4 acre site. Make it 1.4 acres and you could do a double lane. Awesome. You could really lean into a lot of available parking that's not even being used because the driveway or the drive-through is sucking up a lot of that demand. You can build a little minuscule building, and then you can basically get a discount on the amount of taxes that you're paying because the parking, anything that's used for the movement or storage of vehicles is deeply discounted when the assessor comes along, even though it requires the city to now run a lot more frontage and look at all of the public realm improvements that have gone into this site that are not present, again, on this site. So there's been a lot of good public money being spent on these types of sites at a fraction of the value being created on a per acre basis. And then we go to our target, and I could have gone on and found slightly more sites. This is consuming a full 10 acres at barely $1 million an acre, or just over $1 million per acre on a value per acre basis. And this is your new stuff. This is before it goes vacant. And it will, because they all go vacant. Over time, your Sam's Clubs, your Walmarts, your Targets, they all go out of business. And then they sit, and then they immediately go and apply for a reduction in any kind of taxes that are being applied to the property, while these 10 acres sit in this condition. And so with that contrast, you could have something that was generating $41 million per acre. That's a 2-story building. I'm not talking your towers. 2-story building with a doctor, or I think it's a law office, a lawyer sitting in it. Or you could have 10 acres of this. And so at Strong Towns we say, what if we began to take some of these standards, and we can call them standards, they were the standards that were not written down, they were just known from our ancestors, that when we build this way, it maximizes returns. When we build this way, it stores value. When we build this way, it creates the conditions in which a modest change of this building taking on a 3rd story, doesn't immediately affect the entire block, but actually allows for just that change to occur. And then because this has been improved, now all of a sudden that next door building is like, well, maybe I can improve, maybe, and you begin to create this ladder that builds a greater capacity, whereas this site is going to sit under single ownership for a long, long, long time until it ever gets redeveloped. And in time, as we see in places like Buffalo, and we see all over the place, it's a financial albatross sort of hanging around people's necks because you have committed so much public resources to the provision of access to these sites. Again, with parking that's free, easily accessible, and very available, but at a significant cost, especially when we say, what else could we be doing with these sites? In Mount Vernon, Washington, so clear across the country, I took a look at the 27 acres that the Walmart was using and compared it to their little food co-op. And so this is the number I used of that Walmart flying in from Bentonville, $327,000. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And meanwhile, the hippies at the food co-op show up with their 30,000. It's like, oh, come on, come on. But if we actually asked, if we needed to build out, if we built at the same level of intensity the food co-op as we used the Walmart site, we would only use this much of it. And then what do you do with the rest of it? Whatever you want, whatever the community needs, whatever the opportunity presents, whatever you would see fit within the entire downtown area, which much like the Skagit Valley Food Co-op is filled with little buildings, smaller structures, all of the types of things that fill those gaps and create opportunities, and crucially are not owned by a family in Arkansas, but are owned by Bob and Tim and Sally and Sue and Rena and whoever else happens to show up in the community, whoever else passes it down to family members. So many hands, so few hands, so much created, so little created, and we still roll out the welcome mat for this. And so I looked at it and I said, how much tax revenue has been lost in their community due to the change in development pattern? So yes, $327 brought in, but all of these money bags were left on the table. And the standards brought this about. And there's nothing stopping a site like this from being developed, much like your downtown, much like the smaller sites, much like those types of things, except for the suburban standards that we've smuggled back into our core, smuggled out to the outer reaches. And a key culprit in this is certainly the requirement, municipally imposed requirements of parking. All of your new construction, I see a lot of parking. There's not a shortage of that. But when we looked at the financial performance of the community, there's a shortage of viable, revenue-generating property within the city that is adding to the public purse rather than draining it. A significant drain is all of the streets, all of the networks, all of the piping, all of that type of stuff that also exists in the downtown, but it's actually in the downtown being optimized for a lot more uses, a lot more economic activity with more to come as the work of downtown revitalization continues. And so a core insight of Strong Towns is that land is a base resource for building lasting prosperity, and it must not be squandered needlessly. And notice, this is not just me being like, well, I like the old building, I don't like the Target. No. I can basically check all of those assumptions at the door. It's not about aesthetics or how things look. It's about, are we making good use or bad use of things? Right now, my son is taking on a small project. They're doing entrepreneurship, and he's selling pet rocks to his classmates, who are also going to be selling him stuff, so I don't know how they're going to make any money on this. But he's already in for about $40 because he bought rocks for $1.50, and then he bought a whole big set of acrylic markers, and then he needed some special kind of watercolor ones, and so he's in for $40, and he's selling pet rocks. And so I was having a little conversation with him, and I said, you're going to be selling at your little student market and encouraging parents to participate, but you've got a long ways to go to catch up with how much you're in for. And it kind of dawned on him because he had big plans. He was already starting to think like, all right, at Christmas time, he said to me, he said, I'm going to actually be able to buy a present for myself from my pet rock money. I said, no, buddy. You've got to go a long ways before you get there. And our cities need that reality check as well. That if we continue to operate at a loss in many of our residential neighborhoods, where the amount of cost to put in and maintain and keep up miles and miles of infrastructure, one simple metric is the amount of infrastructure per mile per person. So a mile of infrastructure, how many people are contributing to the upkeep of those things? One of the challenges is that our standards are the things that we can put under scrutiny, really truly commit to reforming. Those reforms don't have to happen all at once. You can take on portion by portion, as the city of Fargo already has started to. The growth plan, from what Arlette has been sharing about it, from some of the insights that I picked up just reading through some of the preliminary materials, you're starting to move in these directions. You're starting to create the conditions. One of the things, we wrote an article about a street in Fargo this was Main Street and Broadway, both within 2 years of each other. Lots of uses, lots of different participants. What significant, is that a 5-6-story building there? Significant concentration of economic opportunity. Yeah, some of these are bigger than that lawyer's office that I was showing you, but the idea of them being sort of working together to build in-depth prosperity. This is what it became. And what I found striking in the article that Jen wrote for us, she said, the city's traffic engineers at the time when a lot of that work of saying, let's make Broadway more walkable, let's make Broadway more suitable for a broader range of uses, they pushed back saying, well, you can't do that because it'll slow down cars. So that not only was parking in the priority lane, which is we got to have tons of parking, but then secondarily, we have to have rapid movement through our cities by people and vehicles, or else we're going to have disaster, gave rise to then the resolve to say, what if we took a different path? And we can see what those two paths look like. And so even that work of, in the contemporary times, defending the ability of a street like this to function as a really good street was really important. In contrast, this stood out to me. I think they were quoting a planner from the city. No one I spoke to could say exactly how Main Avenue's design came to prioritize cars over people. It can just happen. It can happen through setting of new standards. It can happen through sort of doubling down on the idea, well, if some is good, more is better. If 4 lanes is good, what about 6? If the requirement of ample parking, what if we make that even more? And you get a pattern of development that is very challenging for the city to actually cover its costs within the community. One of the challenges that we see also in a lot of our existing neighborhoods is that we've made them immune to change or resistant to change. We've allowed a lot of our standards to assume that there is an acceptable amount of exclusion that can happen by class. So of course you're going to have minimum lot sizes. Of course houses are going to have to be above 1,500 square feet. Or of course you're going to have ample setbacks so that we have large lawns. All of those things driving up the cost to be able to live in those neighborhoods. Which, if it's the private market, is okay. But if the city is actually actively requiring all of those things, that seems very counterproductive to the city's purpose of providing a great place for all to live a prospering life. And in this context, one of the exercises we encourage people to do is take a look at your existing neighborhoods and demonstrate and illustrate where could we see more neighborhood investment occur. If you're in this space at all, you've probably heard the word infill housing. Infill housing, I totally understand it. I'm not saying put it on a banned words list, but infill does sound like something you get at the dentist. Infilling that gap, that gap, that gap, that gap. It's sort of like the planner gets a top-down view and says, oh, we could probably put something there. What we can actually help neighbors and others who are skeptical to really grapple with is, we're just talking neighborhood investment. The return of neighborhoods investing in their properties, the return of neighbors helping each other to fill those gaps, bringing in different types of housing, bringing in different types of opportunities. This little garage becoming a workplace, for instance, or becoming a cider dispensary, or whatever you want it is that you want to go in. But notice also the many different people that can participate in filling in those gaps if you retain that fine-grained urbanism that our ancestors recognized that lawyer's office demonstrates works really well in cities. Small, distinct parcels that anybody can build on and use more fully to their bigger or to their fuller potential. Instead, what we get in a lot of our places is under single ownership, or eventually it becomes stratified ownership, a single dominant built form that just takes over the entire area. This is a townhouse development in my city in Delta, British Columbia, taking up several blocks that suddenly are disrupted in order to build this. And one of the challenges that we have, this is veering out of sort of parking and financial productivity to questions around housing, is people are understandably hesitant to endorse this type of change in their neighborhood. They instinctively say, I'd be okay with this, because this would be gradual, this would be incremental, this would take longer, but over time we could see, oh, if there's additional needs, we can meet those needs. The trouble is, this is virtually impossible in most of our neighborhoods. This is the thing that if you have the right amount of money, the right amount of connections, you go into the city planning office and you basically say, poop, here's what I did in Dallas, here's what I did in Chicago, in some neighborhood, and here's what I'm gonna do in Fargo. We see this all the time. And this is one of those challenges that at Strong Towns we say, we need to return to a pattern that says, this is normal. This is how we can normalize a gradual, incremental change within our communities, and doing it on a wide scale lifts up the capacity to be able to cover the streets, to be able to cover all the pipes, all of that infrastructure to be able to help with this. And so it can also look like the ways in which people's experience of housing change in their neighborhood will look like. This is not somebody's first choice of what they want their house and the front of their house to look like, but it is the response when you have to meet a double parking requirement, 2 spaces per unit. This is what you can do with a single lane on the side if you don't have that requirement, because there's going to be a market requirement for that parking, but it won't be dictated as to what that exactly looks like. These are all double occupancy. Some of it may be at the behest of the person looking to buy it, but how much you want to bet that this is full of stuff, not cars? I'd bet at that. I know my own habit. When we lived in a townhouse, we had a garage. That thing was full of stuff, and we parked on the street. So even when you require it, it's not even being properly used according to the standard that was there. And the challenge that we have in our place is there's a great little board game of like, imagine you're a property developer looking to invest in your neighborhood. Here are all of the tangles. Here are all of the challenges that you're going to have to face. And this is part of the story in which, how do we get more Chick-fil-A's and Targets and those big block developments? That happens because we've made everything else nearly impossible or so challenging for us to work through. And so at Strong Towns, we encourage people, or communities, to allow the next increment by right, because one of the challenges that we face is that we've traded complexity, adaptability, the stuff that can happen in neighborhoods and in retail strips and all of these things, we traded that for just growth and predictability, targets and big block developments. And this is going to be the challenge that we face in our places. We need to legalize and normalize small, again, if your first order priority is ample parking, this is a nightmare. But I bet it's not a nightmare to live in. And I bet it's not a nightmare in the neighborhood. And I bet it's not even a nightmare on the neighborhood streets, because many of the people that are living smaller are actually living car light or car free. And yes, in Fargo, a significant number of people in the population either have to live without a car for financial reasons, for health reasons, for driver's license being taken away reasons, for simply being under the age of having a driver's license reasons, so many different things. So that all of a sudden to say this is a viable alternative for you is something that can provide a ton of potential. And so my mantra with community members is always, there's always a market requirement for parking. Parking doesn't simply evaporate when you say, oh, we don't have municipally imposed requirements. There are businesses that do well when they have ample and even free parking. There are other types of businesses that kind of don't need that quite as much. It's something that's more suitable if you want to walk a little distance from a municipally owned parking lot or a parking ramp, as you have here, and get to a business. And so one of the challenges that we have is we would say there's always a market requirement. If you're building new condos for the ultra wealthy, you better have helipads. That shouldn't be a municipally imposed requirement that all luxury housing has to have helipads, but I can bet there's some private developer in New York that's like, well, I gotta have a helipad. That's the way that I sell this. Fine, go for it. In my city, we had a significant housing project. They said, we're doing 2 spaces per unit. I said, I think you're gonna regret that. They said, nope, that's what the market requires. I said, all right, blessings to you. I think you're wrong, but that's okay. But the municipally imposed requirements are so often over what is actually required. Think of all of those little lots that I showed you. Which of those requires more parking? Well, it'll vary depending on what's on that site, right? And it'll vary depending on who the intended buyer is. And yet, the municipally imposed requirements just level it and don't fit and don't apply. And that's why not only in the downtown, but actually you'll be very safe to do this throughout your city. And you won't see drastic, immediate reductions of parking, except in places where it makes sense to do so, as well as you will see gradually the adaptation of those neighborhoods to do things that require just a little less parking and work a little bit better within the community. Parking mandates apply uniform standards to distinct parcels and contexts. This is my city. This is in Lethbridge, Alberta, where I grew up. I grew up on a dairy farm outside of it, but my parents now live near this. And what I see is, yes, they put in housing and it's rental housing, but the vast majority of it was to meet the standards. They had to provide all of this additional parking. And I drive by there every time that I go to see my folks. It's never full. And yet, they met the standard. Those standards that were smuggled in and basically have made this something that could have been significantly more had they built it out. The market requirement for parking places the onus on the property owner to correctly estimate need, rather than simply saying, well, let's see if the city gets this right. That's one of the challenges that we face. The other thing is there's always a market requirement for parking that aligns with moments when building changes occur. This is my son's school. We just actually finished construction of this expansion to my son's school. This is my wife with our guide dog puppy that we are training right now in the photo there, so I'm proud of that one in particular. But it was interesting. The building was built in 1994, and over time we basically went from about 100 students up to about 300, which is why the requirement for the expansion was there. But curiously, in those years of adding all those students, adding additional classes, adding additional teachers, we never had to change the parking lot. But the moment that we went to do the expansion, then it was like, oh, and there was almost this like, you could imagine the plan checker being like, wait, your parking lot is so little for the number of teachers that you have. And it was this only at the moment when a significant change was being introduced that all of a sudden it was like, well, you have to address this. But we managed just fine. We've been managing just fine. Staff were carpooling, staff were doing all sorts of things. You work with the assets that you have, and if you need to bring those changes in, you would be welcome to do that. But I'll tell you what, we would not have built as much parking when we did the expansion to catch up the site compared to what the city required of us. And it meant much of this green space in the photo isn't green space, it's asphalt. I think we could manage with a little less parking, but the city insisted we couldn't. And so one of the things that we encourage our communities is to make laws that address nuisances, not uses. This is part of a longer talk, but I'm going to hasten to my end here just so we can have a discussion, is that land is a base resource for building lasting prosperity. It must not be squandered needlessly. And one of the challenges that we face with our standards for parking is that they often overshoot actual needs, which again, I would argue the private market can bear the cost of that if they're willing to. Or they can make a smart bet that I think will pay off for them and really help them. We know it also drives up the cost of housing. It consumes valuable land and still doesn't solve on-street parking conflicts. Parking commissions and parking management does that work for us. This, again, just a couple of examples. This is Pocatello, Idaho, two older buildings. If they were to meet their parking requirements, this is what was built. This was what the law required of them if ever they were to have newly built it. Well, which of these spaces do we want to see? The location, they had a former YMCA, vibrant hub for the community, completely at odds with what the standards are required for that community. And so one of the things that we want to endorse and encourage as a path to building lasting prosperity is for the traditional development pattern to be reintroduced as just our core assumption in our places. Allowing for incremental growth that is driven by local needs, that is responsive to local needs, but also crucially, this is my community in Ladner, creating opportunity through proximity. Our standard said we can probably replicate closeness through access by car, but it's proven to be financially a nightmare. It's proven to be a drain on our communities. What previously we did by proximity, by closeness, we said, well, actually, the car solves that for us, but it actually hasn't. The car comes at a significant cost. And I drive one. I recognize the impacts that it has, and I'm actually pleading with my community, can we continue to do what built lasting prosperity in our community rather than the type of horizontal expansion that's taken over those fields? And so out of this, I'm going to skip through right to, Norman, Oklahoma. They just said, we have parking requirements. We think they're really we think they apply. So they just changed the code. They said should or may have this much parking. So they kept the standard. They just said it should have parking, but it doesn't require it. All of a sudden, some of the projects still met the requirements. Many others said, oh, thank the Lord, we don't have to meet that high bar anymore. We can actually meet where the need is and get there. If parking is such a problem holding the city back, how come the streets thrive with people when closed to cars during special events? We see this all the time with farmers markets. We see this all the time with festivals, all sorts of different things like this. I'll mention parking benefit districts if we need to, but I'll leave it there because I want to take time. I think we have till 8 o'clock for discussion as well. Questions, rebuttals, rejections, complaints? While I hijack? Yeah, Colton. And the truth is, you could do that with a bus right now. Yeah. You could just paint in lanes, and they can even be in the center of the street, provided that you have paths for people to then get in an ADA compliant way to the curb. But you would definitely be able to do that. And we do see some that are center run, or you can do it on the sides. But there's a tremendous amount of potential. In fact, with buses, they will work very effectively in centers because they don't have to contend with right turning traffic. And so you can increase your headways, your speed that the buses are moving through the community, which then you create these nodes of every bus stop creates the potential for a customer pool that's available that didn't have to come with a car, that didn't have to have a car that needed to be monitored, that didn't have a car that needed to take up however much space a car takes up, instead shows up and is more efficient. And one of the challenges that we have in a lot of our places is that when you arrive, nobody asks you, hey, how did you get here? If you walked, or if you biked, or if you parked at some distance but have hit up 4 or 5 shops, you are the counter to every business official or leader that says, my customers need to be able to park right outside of my business. And yet they don't know because they don't ask. And so when we've had local conversation groups that set up tents downtown, and they asked questions of people that were passing by, they said, what do you want to see more of here? They're like, oh, larger sidewalks, please. Can we have more shops? Can we have more activity on the weekends? Can we see more things like bike, places that I can store my bike, or somewhere I can put a stroller that I don't have to wheel the stroller in the door and slam into the display and then have to explain why I knocked over the merchant stuff. Like, is there spaces that we can do for that? And only a fraction of the respondents said, we want parking. Everybody else, pardon me, was saying, we want other things. In fact, many of the things that are made difficult by the continued requirement of parking. And one of the things, I love what you're doing downtown, because if ever there's a requirement for parking, it would be in a downtown area that up until not that long ago was defined by many people coming in and then leaving. And even in such a high need area, the recognition was, we can get rid of our standards and we'll be fine. And so the idea that they must be maintained out in our more suburban areas seems especially ludicrous when in the places where arguably you would have the greatest need for them has been shown time and time and time again to actually not need that. To me is a very compelling reason why we can simply say, we'll be okay if this just no longer applies. Again, a lot of your private small scale or larger developers, they're going to provide ample parking still. People want their garages, people want these types of things. I would never argue for a parking maximum, for example. I think it's a counterproductive policy because you are trying to do on the opposite, get the standards right. And what if you're wrong? You're putting a lot of cost on the public when you do that. But the outcome of it is these types of things can create great opportunities for a node and a corridor to really benefit from it as you go through your community. And the other thing is, when they first built this out, they didn't intend to have the perfect network. They just needed to connect 2 stops, maybe 3, so that way you had enough fares to pay for a driver. We get totally over our skis when we come to transit and the way in which we try to say, well, we have to have the perfect network. And it's almost like, a beautiful mind, sort of like, we need this and we need this, and the bus stops, well, they can't be basic, they have to be special. And then we need, heated seats, and you're like, just back up. You just need to connect productive places to other productive places and route people to them and identify where are there likely to be paying customers? Where are there likely to be customers that will pay because there's value in what's being provided? Students to vital areas. That makes sense. Workers to the residential areas. That makes sense. We can create those conditions. I'm always at risk of oversimplifying things, but I feel like with transit, we need a good dose of that. So. Yeah, other thoughts? Yes. How did I calculate it? Yeah. So it's the city of Fargo. They're the assessor office. They have they create property reports for every single property. So I think I did that in about 25 minutes to pull up the numbers for Fargo. I'd be happy to show you, connect to the internet and do that. But they have in their GIS software is the graph, whatever GIs stand for, the mapping tool already has all of that info. So there's, I think, 3 different versions of it, or 3 different, like, when you go to the mapping tool, it'll say, what are you looking for? And it's property information. And then if you click detailed report, it tells you the acreage, or in this case, it was square footage of the lot. And so I just converted that to acres, and then the assessed value, the most recent assessed value. The one missing piece, and you may have this elsewhere, is what's the property tax. That's really interesting because people will sometimes sort of balk at the value per acre and say, well, that's just like how much value is in that building. I'm like, yes, but that is like in somebody's wallet or in somebody's like portfolio in their own way. But when you break it down to like how much property tax they pay on a per acre basis, that's where you can say like, this is why we can't have nice things. Because we used to have properties that returned a significant amount of property tax on a per acre basis, and now we get just a fraction of it. So the logical outcome is if I fed my child high calorie meals and now I feed them on like gruel, I'm not going to get a very healthy child any longer. And that's what we've done to our places. So, yeah. But really smart people do like a map for the whole city with those values and like represent it graphically. That's way above my pay grade. So I just do spot checks because then it can also help. My favorite is the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta. They have a brand new power center on 11 acres. And it contributes, I think, 1/5 the amount of property tax on a per acre basis that this little 2-story building, kind of like the doctor's office there, or lawyer's office, it looks like that, but it's called Sugar Daddy's Cheesecake. And so without being too impolite, I'll say, like, your sugar daddy treats you much better than the brand new stuff that you've been building at the outskirts of your community. Look to what we used to do because the numbers don't lie. They show and justify why this level of pattern of development. And again, this isn't, I could have done and found spectacular numbers in your downtown by looking at your large towers, any of your more substantial structures. Deliberately, the most I showed you was a 2-story building. Or maybe that one was 3-story, the one from 1898. That's max. Not that I'm anti-height. You can add that in time as another increment of developing a neighborhood. But the reality is like even the lowest bar is significantly higher in these spaces. Yeah. Yeah. So it still feels like it's the leading edge. So there's a project by Opticos Design, for example, out in Oklahoma, where they were building out a large swath of land next to a lake. And so it was very much a drive-in destination space. And they very deliberately, and some of it was second homes and things like that, they provided 1 parking space per residential unit. And they said, we've not had a single issue, and it's at full build out. And so that is an edge case where like, it's not even like connected to anything with a hope of transit or anything like that. It was very deliberately done as lakefront sort of beach resort sort of style, where everybody is assumed to be driving in. 1 space per unit, and they said we haven't had an issue at all. That space is available on the streets, or that some of the units will have a garage, some of them don't. They have shared or sort of available parking spaces that are connected to it. Another thing that we see is a lot of the smaller scale developments are only feasible if you're allowed to have that extra unit or that 3rd unit that's available. The city of Edmonton has made this change quite a while ago. I really like their language on this. They said, we are introducing open option parking. And so they weren't saying like, now we have no consideration of parking, but they say, and work through it with the developer. They're like, here are your options for parking. You can have lots of spaces or not very many spaces. They can be at the front, they can be at the back. We want to know where the spaces are. That's the one thing they do ask of their developers. If you have a parking space, can we not register it, but basically like show us in the map where it's not going to be. But in the site planning, they basically say, come up with it as you wish. They have 8 plexes that are going on with no parking because it's 100 feet from a transit stop. And they're selling. They're selling like hotcakes. The rents are, holding steady. People are willing to rent that, especially in the context of seniors that are now getting to the point where they're considering, hey, with an e-bike and an Uber, I can get to many, locations if you live in a neighborhood that makes that available. So that is certainly a consideration. But the bigger data of like the major home builders are not on board yet. They're continuing to do ever larger garages, ever larger cathedral ceilings, ever larger amenities, and fancier granite countertops. Yeah. It does, yeah, because they will say like, "Ooh, we need to make this project pencil," and so there's a North Dakota bonus in Fargo, which is, oh, by the way, you're not on the hook for all of this additional cost. In Colorado, they found a different way to create like a fourth level of government that basically takes on the responsibility for the upkeep of all the streets, called a metro district in their area, and those things are deeply insolvent, and residents that are living there have been paying nominal fees, and all of a sudden like their rates are going way up. Every time that that's offloaded, but even in the Arizona developments or the California developments where the builder up front says, we're paying for all the streets, all of the roadways, the moment they finish, they gift it to the city. And you'll see it in the ACFRs, the financial reports, the amount of infrastructure, I think it'll be, sometimes it'll say gifted or not donated, but it's like gifted or donated. And it's like this really like hefty chunk, and you're like, cool, great. Now you're on the hook for that. And that street is like a pipe is a good pipe until it's not, and then you've got to deal with it. And there's so much that's born up in the idea like, oh, we're good, you know, and cities, I'll take that from you, I'll take that off your plate, I'll help you with that. And so the longer term question of how do you build, like, how do you use your land really well is something that I, as a dairy farmer's kid, understood, which was we had 80 acres. We needed that 80 acres to be remarkably productive. If we had a bad spring, it meant that the crop didn't grow very well and it was going to be a tougher year. And so on a bushels per acre, I could use bushels per acre because you guys are close enough to farming community centers to know what I'm talking about. There too, we see that. And so we, Strong Towns is connected with new urbanist developers who they are able to show their cash flow and their projects are significantly better than a lot of the like quick turnaround builds that we're seeing in many of our neighborhoods and many of our communities. I saw it from the airplane. You've got a lot of that sort of 2 mile by 2 mile by 2 mile county block that just gets completely upended, and the level of density is so low, and the amount of required infrastructure is so high on a per mile basis that it's going to be a real challenge to keep that up. Yeah, and you got to pay for the Fargo Dome to be upgraded or improved, and keep the lights on. And you've got more spaces like a library. Like there's all of these other things, which means that all of our like private realm really needs to earn its keep, and we've let a lot of that not happen. Yeah. Yes, and some very perceptive builders have started to say the rent does not include a parking spot, but you can rent a parking spot. Sure. The trouble they find is nobody wants a parking spot. So they will quickly, and the idea, workplaces have done this too, where, so I mentioned my son's school. I wanted my school administrators to work with the city and say, we are giving our staff who park a parking space, and those who don't park, $100 a month. And we would have not had to build that extra space. Because that $100, that incentive, or the idea that that parking space is one thing, or if you prefer, you can have what it is costing us. We see that with a lot of rental in particular. The moment you say your rent doesn't include a parking space, but you're more than welcome to rent one, many people are like, oh, I can rationalize, I say $200 a month. I can spend that on Uber like 12 times in the month. I can use a e-bike for part of the time. I can work with somebody else. They rent a space and I share the car and the cost with them, or I get involved in a car co-op. We see that happen all the time. The trouble is we've always linked it, house and car parking, always connected. Businesses that have, or offices where they have 800 employees and they don't want to provide 800 parking spaces because they want to make better use of their campus, the moment that they say, you can have a parking space or you can have some other cash offering, that is a huge help. The other question that would be longer term is, if the federal government says that even if you take home a stapler, you're supposed to list it as a benefit from work, or there's all sorts of things that if you get it through your work, it's a taxable benefit. Parking spaces have never been a taxable benefit. Arguably they should be, because everybody that's coming in by transit is actually saving the community money by not requiring as much road infrastructure, and yet they're not consuming a parking space, whereas those that require a more costly way of getting there are the ones that have the free parking. So though I'm not in favor of turning around and being like, all right, nail them as a taxable benefit, but the flip side is incentivize it with those types of things. The other consideration is just that buried parking is going to be what, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per spot. That runs up the cost significantly, and anything that you can do to introduce a way of tamping that down means they may not sell each unit for the, as much, because it doesn't come with a parking space. So you can imagine a realtor being like, yeah, you're not going to want that one because it doesn't have a parking space. There's a lot of layered in assumptions about who wants what, but then they can build an extra 15 units in the space that's opened up by not having to provide that parking. And you don't get parking Armageddon in these spaces where these buildings are located unless they're stuck in the wrong spot. So that wrong spot is the market saying you never should have built here without any parking because people require it here. But in many other places, you can get by without it or with a lot less. I hope that, does that, yep. Mm-hmm. But awesome that the bank is doing bus tours of missing middle housing. That's fantastic. My always slight correction is it's not missing, it was just banished. Like we know exactly where it went away. And so it's not missing in the sense of like, oh, does anybody know where Waldo is? It's, we got rid of that sucker. And now we're regretting it because our communities are not as vibrant as they could otherwise be. Oh, if I keep going, I'm gonna get radical. So you guys gotta, for a Canadian. Several layers of that. One is anything you can do to introduce or incentivize more backyard cottages or garage conversions or attic restorations to create another living space up there. There is a direct correlation, or I want to be careful, but there's a correlation at minimum, if not necessarily a cause. I'm pretty sure it's a causation as well, that smaller unit sizes have a direct impact on the likely need for parking. It doesn't immediately remove it, but many of those backyard cottages, like in the city of Edmonton, which has similar climate to what Fargo has to deal with, you guys thrive in. I moved to a more moderate climate because I'm a wimp. But in that context, Ashley Salvador, who's the sitting council member there, did a study as part of her master's program on all of their backyard, they call them garden suites. And significant, I think it was 60% of the occupants didn't have a vehicle. And she was surveying a whole ton of these backyard cottages, and people didn't have vehicles because they were in neighborhoods or it was family owned. So they were in the, the people in the main house had the vehicle and the people in the back house didn't. That would be one area, is at minimum just leveling up the potential for neighborhoods to include that. The second part of it is diverse unit sizes within multifamily is really important. The trouble is a lot of our production builders just want to replicate box. And so you're not going to get a diversity of sizes within any given project, which is where, to that image that I showed, if you can then say, we generally are going to look at projects and not want assembly to occur, lot assemblies, where you just take over 8 lots and build out all of there. And oftentimes, the moment that parking is not the thing that dictates where the buildings go, because we see this, if you're going to do surface lot parking, you basically start with, all right, I need all of these parking stalls, now can I stick a building anywhere else? And I've worked with architects and they're like, yep, we basically just like lay out what the parking lot is going to look like and then try to plunk down buildings around it and maybe like massage the parking lot a bit, or what if we did a lane, but then, oh shoot, but we can't turn vehicles around there. So they basically create parking lots and add buildings. And that's what a lot of our large site development looks like. That's the project I showed you in Lethbridge. They built the parking lot and then stuck some buildings around it and basically determined how many they could add. The last thing would just be anything that is near existing retail stands a chance of being able to be suitable for people with reduced parking requirements. At minimum, the idea that like no space or no site should have to provide more than one parking space per unit or per home makes sense from that perspective. If you're going to retain it, it can't, the idea that it has to be more than one per space. For a 6-bedroom home, if that person is willing to buy a lot and build on it and put 6 bedrooms in and have 1 parking space. They might just be, a Mennonite family, or they, a Dutch family. Like that may be just totally normal for them. But the reality is often it'll be like on a per bedroom basis. You have to meet a certain standard for parking requirements, or I've seen all sorts of different versions of the formula. And then the last element is to be able to demonstrate how often the available required parking is not even being used in your suburban style development. You guys maybe are a little bit more likely to have, in winter where people are bringing their vehicle into the garage rather than out. But in a lot of cases, a lot of that activity is still coming to the street. So managing curb parking is one of those things that the community can say collectively, how do we want to use this public realm and make good use of it there? So that would be a consideration as well. What's a good way to know what's happening, maybe Paul or Arlette, what's happening with the comprehensive plan and what the stages are that next few upcoming rounds for consultation would look like? Because maybe that's a takeaway from here is, one, do more of this, less of what that became, but there's very practically things that people can do. What would you suggest? Nothing happens, or the challenge, one of the things we're critical of at Strong Towns is the planning profession in general suffers from not having skin in the game. So by not actually being the individuals owning property, or not actually being the individuals that are directly impacted by the policies, you can have like a 3rd-tier employee in the consulting firm using the highlighter to mark specific areas as multifamily, single family detached with garden suites or accessory dwelling units. And the result can be that can be your next 20 years, even though it was done by a 3rd-tier employee with highlighter, basically just sort of putting stuff on a map. And now all of a sudden you're stuck with it, and the person had no skin in the game. So this is borrowing from Nassim Taleb, who just says there's an asymmetry of risk when you don't have skin in the game. And one of the ways that we address that is by getting ourselves a lot closer to just those dynamics of the change needs to be understood and applied locally, or even sub-locally as much as possible. So it's a bit of a pushback on the idea of get the perfect plan, because oftentimes, like you said, there's that trepidation about what that plan will consist of as well. And so I will close with just a quick pitch, which is, if this matters to you, and if you're not yet a Strong Towns member, I would love for you to consider doing so. Just check out the Strong Towns site if you haven't been there. One of the reasons why is next week is Strong Towns Member Week, and part of my recognition is we are sharing Strong Towns material. You are sharing Strong Towns material with an ever-growing audience. I think we had 10 million people watching Strong Towns content on YouTube this past year, just continuing to reach into more and more places, more and more communities. And members do make that possible. Members paid for me to be able to come out on the road, give a talk today. I'm really glad to be able to do this, but I'm also looking forward to returning and seeing the changes wrought within the community, but also the greater urgency and vibrancy created by Strong Towns Fargo. So hats off to all you all for the work you're doing, and thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. I think I saw a librarian doing a double check on us a couple of times, so we're almost at our time. Arlette, back to you.
Thank you, Norm.
Yeah, thank you.